Okay, yeah, so this is going to be about when it might be acceptable for the state to censor or intervene against conspiracy theories in Western liberal democracies. So I think it's really interesting to have the kind of shift from purely epistemological questions about conspiracy theories in philosophy to some questions about the morals, the ethics, and the politics of conspiracy theories, which I think is a really good way to, a good direction for philosophy to go. So what is my position? Well, my position is, broadly speaking, that within a liberal democracy, and I'm using the term liberal democracy pretty broadly, not going for any specific type of liberalism when I'm arguing. So within liberal democracy, broadly conceived, sometimes the state has grounds for censoring or intervening against some types of conspiracy theories some of the time, once very strict conditions have been met. So basically, I think if they contain hate speech, which is inflammatory and might lead to a high risk of violence, then I think that it might be acceptable for the state to intervene and maybe enact criminal penalties against people who are peddling those views. And I think that also less harmful discourse, things like discriminatory language, which isn't hateful, which isn't inciting violence as such, but is still discriminatory. I think the state can sometimes intervene against those kind of conspiracy theories as well, but maybe to a lesser extent, maybe some kind of softer form of intervention like civil laws might be justified when it comes to those sorts of theories. So I'm going to start with a critique of current approaches. There's a bit that's been written about this. I wouldn't say a huge amount. There's Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule's very well-known paper from 2009 about causes and cures of conspiracy theories. I'm not going to be talking about that because I think that's already been talked about quite a lot. And I think that there's quite good reasons for not accepting their particular way of going about things. There's a more recent paper by Civic and Hardos about when it might be acceptable to use state intervention within liberalism against conspiracy theories with what they call unreasonable content, right, which falls outside the realm of protected free speech, at least some of the time. And I'm going to quickly explain why I don't think that works. So I think there's something actually importantly right about what they say. What they say is that we can't go around saying that conspiracy theories should be banned, or censored, or discouraged by the state if they're irrational or have epistemic defects. So that seems to me to be correct because all sorts of theories we're habitually irrational. There are lots of conspiracy theories like the famous Paul is dead conspiracy theory, which is doesn't really have immoral content, unreasonable content. It's kind of irrational. I assume everyone agrees it's irrational, but it's not really morally bad or anything like that. The state, a liberal state, could not go around banning all such theories or intervening against such theories without necessarily becoming illiberal. Because obviously the sorts of non-conspiratorial beliefs are also very irrational. So I think they're right about that. They argue that we can use a moral criterion for deciding to be, and they say conspiracy theories with unreasonable content can be targeted. They're public reason liberals, so very, very broadly speaking, they follow the later John rules, and they think that the liberal state and at least its core constitutional essentials should be justified to all reasonable citizens. What happens if you're not a reasonable citizen, though? Who counts as a reasonable citizen? Well, they're contested questions, but they basically follow another Rawlsey and Jonathan Kwong in saying sometimes we can restrict the free speech of unreasonable persons. What's an unreasonable person? Well, generally speaking, it's defined as if you're an unreasonable person or if you have an unreasonable doctrine, if you don't accept that citizens are free and equal and society is a venture that's a fair venture of social cooperation, or a fair system of social cooperation for mutual benefit. So this seems to work quite well on the face of it. So unreasonable conspiracy theories, Holocaust denial, great replacement theories seem to have pretty unreasonable content on the face of it. Whereas there's lots of seemingly harmless conspiracy theories, or at least theories which don't have any directly unreasonable content, even if they are irrational, like Paul is dead, Elvis is alive, which would not be things that could legitimately be leaned against. The problem, I think, is when it comes to defining and delineating the boundary between reasonable and unreasonable persons doctrine. So if you're a public reason liberal, you've got this recurring problem that your definition of reasonableness either becomes so broad that you can't justify your theory to all reasonable people because it would be impossible, because people hold a wide range of different worldviews, or it's so narrow that the theory kind of becomes circular and trivial. And I think there's something going on there. So if you take someone like Jonathan Fong or Martha Nussbaum's basic definition of reasonableness, they're very broad. Right? It's not clear how many conspiracy theories would even be captured by that definition. If you're saying that you're reasonable if you think you believe in democracy, or you think that citizens are free and equal, and society should be a fair system of cooperation, you probably pretty much everyone would say that's what we believe in. Maybe some fascists, some Nazis would qualify as unreasonable on that definition, but not many theories would be captured by it. On the other hand, if you go for a narrow definition, reasonableness, actually I think that's a lot worse. Not going to be able to go into why that's the case, but I think public reason liberalism tends to end up using a narrow definition of reasonableness. If you use a narrow definition of reasonableness, you end up thinking that a huge number of people who are sort of reasonable in the everyday sense of the term will end up looking quite unreasonable. And therefore, conspiracy theories, lots of different conspiracy theories and lots of other kinds of theories could potentially be censored or intervened, or you could justify intervention against them, and that would start to look quite illiberal. I think that's the problem that they face. So I think a better criterion would be something that's already built into most variations of liberal theory, would be whether or not the theory is likely to lead to a high risk of violence. So, if you take like a classic example of John Stuart Mill's, John Stuart Mill said that if you were to circulate ideas about corn dealers being stars of the poor in the press, that would be okay. That would be within protected free speech. If you were to shout it to an angry mob outside a corn dealer's house, it wouldn't be within protected free speech. If it's incites violence, it's not within protected free speech. And I think this is a better criterion in general than the criterion of reasonableness, which I think is just intrinsically vague and intrinsically woolly. And this is better for deciding when things like criminal penalties could perhaps be used against conspiracy theories. Now, one very obvious problem with this is that it's not an argument about conspiracy theories as such. Just as actually Sabine Hardus' argument was not about conspiracy theories as such, it was about unreasonable content. This isn't about conspiracy theories per se either. Nothing about conspiracy theories that makes them especially prone to inciting violence. Necessarily, lots of things could. The problem is not about conspiracy theories. But obviously, there are quite a lot of prominent conspiracy theories at the same time, which might incite violence. So there is something already built into liberal theory which can deal with some of these issues, I think. So Holocaust denial again would be a good example of that. Yeah, another thing to note is that there's quite a lot of conspiracy theories which you would think are kind of mad or even dangerous, certainly irrational, that would not be covered by this, covered by this criterion either. So if you take something like climate change denial, or maybe vaccine hesitancy might be another example. You might think these things are irrational or even dangerous or quite immoral, perhaps, but they're not going to be covered necessarily by the criterion that the state can legitimately censor things that lead to violence, because these theories don't really directly do that. So there's a lot that's not being covered by this proposal. I think probably that's inevitable if we're operating within a framework of liberal democracy. So I think this is now moving towards an argument that's a bit more specifically geared towards conspiracy theories, which is that I think some conspiracy theories don't necessarily contain an immediate risk of violence, but they might still contain discriminatory content which might target, say, a vulnerable group in society, right? So within liberal democracies already, there's this balance between free speech and a right to reputation, which, obviously liberalism is often associated with, broad protection of free speech, but actually within both the theory and the practice of democracy, there's quite a lot of limitations, and one of those is your right to reputation. Okay, so the right to free speech is balanced against, it's offset to some extent by defamation and libel laws. So I think that these defamation laws, as they exist, often serve to protect people who are wealthy, powerful, famous, whatever. It might be a good idea to consider changing that so that you could have defamation laws to protect vulnerable groups. And it might be that conspiracy theories are particularly prone to making the kinds of, or certain conspiracy theories are particularly likely to make the kinds of claims that would be discriminatory or defamatory against these groups. This is necessarily quite sketchy at this stage, I think, but it's going to come down to the familiar feature that a lot of conspiracy theories have, or at least some conspiracy theories have, which is that you take say, an explanation of conspiracy, and then positive evidence for it doesn't arise, and actually lots of counter evidence rises. So one of the sort of ways in which they deal with this is to expand the number of conspiracy accusations. So the counter evidence is produced by people who are in on the conspiracy, and the evidence for the alternative view, whatever that the official view, if you like, would be fabricated, and so on. And in some cases, I think this can lead to an expansion of, say, claims from just being about a specific event to being targeting whole groups of people who might be vulnerable. So if we take something like a 9/11 conspiracy theory, a 9/11 inside job, about, say, Mossad having been behind it, which I think is one of the popular 9/11 inside job theories. Well, let's imagine that positive evidence doesn't materialize and quite a lot of counter evidence materializes. Through an expansion of accusations to include more and more groups, you could actually end up with something like the idea that, as depicted in this mural, groups of Jewish bankers play Monopoly on backs of the world's poor, or something like that. Now, it wouldn't necessarily push in that direction, and I'm not saying that all 9/11 inside job theories about Mossad necessarily are anti-Semitic in that way, but I think there's certainly a possibility of that kind of thing happening with certain conspiracy theories. I'm not saying that this is a general epistemological problem with conspiracy theories, but I'm saying that perhaps a subset or a subset of a subset of conspiracy theories might be prone to this. So yeah, I think that the best response to this would be to take a kind of proportional approach, which doesn't say something along the lines of, we should be cracking down on all these people with harsh criminal penalties, but instead you might enact something like, reparations or damages to particular groups in particular circumstances, like, for example, similar to historical reparations or something like that. And it could be broadly modeled on something like civil laws, which are currently protection of individuals' reputation. So I'm going to just briefly go through my conditions and limitations to the proposal, because obviously with any form of censorship or state intervention, it's got there's a strong possibility it could be abused, right? So the epistemological constraint, I think, is that these theories do need to be quite far-fetched. It needs to be that they're not ones that might potentially be true or have a strong element of truth, because if they do, they could societally be very beneficial, actually. So they need to be ones that really are quite far out there. The ethical wrongness of the theory needs to be, the bar needs to be set sufficiently high for that. So if it's just like slightly rude or unpleasant, I don't think that would qualify. And of course, the practical constraint is we need to have sufficient evidence that state intervention will actually work and be effective and will not backfire. And in a lot of cases, state intervention against things which you might think are immoral or wrong does actually not work and it backfires, such as you might think with drugs or gambling, prostitution, that kind of thing. Okay, so yes. So one objection I'll just focus on here is that some people might just say, well, I mean, I'm trying to sketch a compromise position, so I'm going to get attacked from both sides. It's either too strong or it's going to be too weak. Some people might think this is too weak. I think Sunstein and Vermeule and Civic and Hardus, people like that, are going for a stronger line than I am. But I would say that it's not as toothless as it might seem, right? So you might think something like, well, in England and Wales, you're not allowed to trespass, right, on people's land, but it's not a criminal offence; it's a civil wrong. But actually, you know, it's not really enforced necessarily very often, right? You might think the same thing would happen here. It's like, well, you know, this is quite toothless. It might be some kind of wrong, but it's not actually going to get enforced. But I would reply that things like defamation laws, in England at least, are quite strong and are quite good at protecting people who are already rich and powerful. So there's no intrinsic reason why you couldn't change them so that they might be able to protect vulnerable groups as well.